was a quiet morning in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind where people went about their routines without much fuss. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the streets. A light breeze rustled through the trees, making the leaves sway gently. Birds chirped from their perches, completing the peaceful scene. A man stepped out of his house, his face calm, almost expressionless. He wasn't in a rush, just walking, enjoying the peace that mornings often brought. He wore simple clothes, a t-shirt and jeans, nothing that stood out or drew attention. The kind of man you could easily pass by without giving him a second thought. Beside him walked his dog, a medium-sized animal with a sleek coat and a friendly demeanor. The dog trotted happily alongside its owner, its tail wagging in time with its steps. They had been doing this for years, these morning walks through the neighborhood, a ritual that both man and dog cherished. The man had no particular destination in mind. He wasn't one for long walks or hiking trips. No, he simply enjoyed these short, simple strolls with his companion. The man had once lived a different life. A life full of danger, secrecy, and incredible skill, but now he found peace in moments like this, walking the quiet streets, letting the world move around him as he stayed grounded in the present. This was his new normal. After years of service, after everything he had been through, he had given up the chaos of his former life, preferring the comfort of simplicity. But the truth about who he was remained hidden from everyone around him. No one knew the depths of his past, the things he had done, the lives he had touched. For most people, he was just another man in the neighborhood. A quiet guy who kept to himself and walked his dog every morning. They had no reason to think otherwise. He was no longer the man who had been in charge of covert operations, who had been known for his unmatched skills in Delta Force. The man they saw now was calm, collected, and unassuming. As the man continued down the street, his dog stopped to sniff the grass at the edge of a driveway. The man slowed his pace, allowing his dog to do its thing. He looked around, his eyes scanning the neighborhood, though he didn't seem particularly concerned. He had grown used to this rhythm, this quiet routine. But on this particular morning, something felt different. A car slowly cruised by, moving at a cautious pace. The man didn't pay it much attention at first. He was used to the occasional car passing by. But this car slowed even further, stopping just a few feet ahead of him. He turned his head slightly, and that's when he noticed the two uniformed officers sitting inside. Their eyes were fixed on him and his dog. There was nothing particularly alarming about the interaction at first. Just a man walking his dog and two officers watching from a patrol car. But something about the way the officers watched him felt off. The man could tell they were sizing him up, trying to figure out if there was more to him than what met the eye. He had been in situations like this before, where people looked at him and saw something they couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way he held himself, the calmness in his posture, or maybe it was something else that made people uneasy. The officers didn't seem to know how to react, and the longer they sat there, the more tension grew in the air. The man could feel the unease in the officers, and he didn't like it. He wasn't one for unnecessary attention. His walks with his dog were supposed to be his escape from everything that had happened before, from the world he had left behind. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He continued walking, the soft patter of his dog's paws against the pavement the only sound for a moment. The officers remained in the car, still watching him but making no move to engage. The man could feel their eyes on his back as he passed by. As he reached the end of the block, he glanced over his shoulder and saw the officers still there, now talking to each other in low voices. One of them pointed in his direction and the other nodded. It was a small gesture, but the man's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. He tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe they were just doing their job. But the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to make a mistake. The dog, sensing the shift in the air, paused for a moment, its tail lowering slightly. It was almost as if the animal could pick up on the tension as well. The man bent down to pet his dog, murmuring a few soothing words, trying to calm the animal. He stood back up and took a deep breath. He needed to stay calm. He needed to finish his walk without making a scene. But as he continued down the sidewalk, he heard the car door open behind him. The officer stepped out of the car, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. The man's heart rate picked up slightly, but he forced himself to remain still, to not make any sudden movements. He could feel the tension building between them. The officer took a few steps toward him, and the man could see the look in his eyes, a mixture of suspicion and caution. "Is everything okay?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm. The man nodded, keeping his voice steady. "Just out for a walk." The officer seemed to study him for a moment, sizing him up as if trying to decide whether to question him further. The dog, sensing something wasn't right, started to bark softly, its stance changing as it stepped in front of the man, alert and protective. "Is this dog registered?" the officer asked, his tone suddenly more direct. The man felt a slight tension in his chest. "Yes," he replied, keeping his voice even. "He's well behaved." The officer looked at the dog, then back at the man. For a moment the two locked eyes, the air thick with unspoken understanding, but the officer didn't seem convinced. "I'm going to need to take a look at his tags," he said, stepping closer. The man could feel the situation escalating, and he wasn't sure how to defuse it. His dog had never shown aggression toward anyone, but it wasn't the same animal it once was. The animal had been through a lot, just like its owner. Both had seen things that others could not understand. The dog, sensing the officer's approach, took a few steps back, growling low in its throat. The officer froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. The man quickly stepped in between them, placing a hand on his dog's shoulder. "He's fine," he said, his voice firm but not raised. "Just calm down." But the officer didn't seem to hear him. In an instant he reached for his gun, pulling it from its holster. The man's heart dropped, and before he could react, the officer had raised it, pointing it toward the dog. Without thinking, the man lunged forward, pushing the officer's arm down just as the gun went off. The sound of the gunshot rang out, sharp and sudden, shattering the stillness of the quiet street. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The man's heart raced in his chest as his hand instinctively grabbed the officer's arm, pushing it down toward the ground. His dog, confused and scared, let out a panicked bark, its stance more defensive now than ever. The officer was equally startled, his face pale as his fingers tightened around the grip of the gun. For a moment he was completely unaware of what had just happened, the shock of the moment clouding his judgment. His other hand reached for his radio, signaling his partner in the car. The man stood there, his own hand still clutching the officer's arm, his body tense and poised to react at a moment's notice. But inside, he was fighting a different battle. He could feel his past creeping up on him. The training, the years of discipline, the instincts honed in life-or-death situations. He had spent so many years keeping his emotions under control, but in that moment, with the tension mounting and his dog standing between him and the officer, it was hard to stay calm. The officer, his face a mixture of confusion and fear, finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his eyes darting nervously from the man to the dog and back again. The man's grip on the officer's arm loosened, but he didn't step back. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, but he needed to make sure the officer understood the gravity of the moment. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to center himself. He wasn't looking for a fight. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but the tension in the air was palpable, and every instinct within him told him he needed to be ready for whatever came next. "I'm not your enemy," the man said, his voice steady, though his words carried a weight that was hard to ignore. "But your dog is scared. I'm just trying to keep the peace." The officer didn't seem to understand, his mind racing as he processed what had just occurred. The gun was still in his hand, the barrel pointing downward, but it was clear he was unsure of how to handle the situation. He had reacted out of fear, and now, standing face to face with someone who didn't seem like a threat, he was unsure how to move forward. The man glanced at his dog, whose tail had now dropped between its legs, sensing its owner's unease. He took another step forward, carefully placing his hand on the animal's back to reassure it. The officer's eyes followed his movements, the gun still gripped tightly in his hand, but now, the man could sense the officer's confusion more than anything else. "I told you," the man said again, his voice softer now. "I'm just walking my dog. This doesn't have to end like this." For a moment it felt as though time had slowed. The officer stood there, the weight of his decision heavy in the air. He could feel the tension between them, could sense the raw power of the man standing before him, but he didn't know how to diffuse it. His instinct screamed at him to call for backup, to take control of the situation before it got worse. But he didn't want to escalate things further. The man continued to stand still, his eyes locked onto the officer's. He wasn't threatening, but his presence alone seemed to command attention. The officer could feel it. Something about this man made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice shaky but more controlled. "Just keep your hands where I can see them," he ordered, his tone firm but still laced with uncertainty. The man didn't argue. He slowly raised his hands, showing the officer he wasn't a threat, even as his mind raced through the options available to him. The situation was precarious. If he made one wrong move, everything could go south in an instant. But before the officer could say anything else, the sound of another car pulling up broke the tension. The man glanced over his shoulder to see a second patrol car arriving, its lights flashing as it pulled up behind the first one. A second officer got out, a woman this time, and she immediately assessed the situation with a practiced eye. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone calm but alert as she approached the scene. The first officer seemed to relax slightly at the sight of his partner, though he didn't lower his gun. "I'm not sure yet," he said, his voice still strained. "This guy's not talking, just standing there." The woman officer turned her attention to the man, taking in his posture, his body language, and the dog at his feet. She noted the tension in his shoulders, the stillness in his eyes. She didn't know who he was, but there was something about him that seemed off. Not in a dangerous way, but in a way that suggested he wasn't the kind of person who would easily be intimidated. "I'm just walking my dog," the man repeated, his voice flat, though his patience was beginning to wear thin. "I've done nothing wrong." The woman officer studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to gauge whether there was more to the situation than met the eye. She could feel the same unease that her partner had experienced, but she didn't immediately jump to conclusions. Instead, she chose to handle the situation with caution, her hand resting lightly on her belt as she waited for the man to speak. "You know," she said, her voice softer now, "you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. If you're just out for a walk, then why not just go on your way?" The man looked at her, his expression unreadable. He considered her words for a moment, weighing his options. His mind was clear, but his emotions were anything but. He had lost his dog, the one thing that kept him tethered to this new life he had built for himself. It hurt more than he cared to admit. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice steady once more. "But your partner made a mistake, and now I'm standing here, explaining myself like I've done something wrong." The woman officer nodded slowly, her gaze shifting between the man and her partner. She could sense the underlying tension, the subtle power in the man's demeanor. He wasn't just a random civilian, and something told her there was more to him than his unassuming appearance let on. "All right," she said, her tone more measured now. "How about we just calm down for a second and figure this out? We're not here to start something." The man nodded, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction. He didn't want to make a scene. He just wanted to finish his walk. But the sting of losing his dog was still there, lingering like an open wound. He wanted answers, and he wanted the officers to understand just how badly they had misjudged him. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the sound of his dog's growl cut through the air again, louder this time, more aggressive. The animal's protective instincts had kicked in once again, and it stood its ground, its body tense as it faced the officers. The man quickly turned to his dog, placing a calming hand on its back, trying to soothe it. He whispered to the animal softly, but the tension was palpable. The officers stood back, waiting for him to get control of the situation. The woman officer stepped forward cautiously, her eyes flicking to her partner for a moment. She didn't want to make the wrong move. Not with this man, not after everything that had already happened. "Let's all take a deep breath," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Nobody needs to get hurt. Let's just talk this out." The man didn't respond right away. He remained still, his hand resting on his dog's back. His mind was working, calculating the best way to de-escalate this. He wasn't afraid of the officers, but he knew that one wrong move could escalate things further. He didn't want that. Not today. He let out a deep breath, then looked at the officers again. "Fine," he said quietly. "Let's talk." The tension in the air seemed to stretch endlessly. Every breath the man took felt heavy, filled with the weight of what had just happened. His dog stood beside him, still agitated, but the man kept his hand on its back, his presence grounding it. He didn't want to show the officers his frustration, though it burned inside him. Losing his dog had been hard enough, and now this being misunderstood. Being judged by strangers who had no idea who he really was, it only added to the sting. He glanced at the woman officer, who seemed to be studying him, her eyes more thoughtful than her partner's had been. She wasn't rushing to draw conclusions. She wasn't quick to make assumptions, and for some reason, that made him feel slightly more at ease. He hadn't expected to find any sympathy in this moment, but there was something about her presence, something calming, that gave him a little hope. The other officer, still holding the gun loosely in his hand, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. He wasn't sure what to make of the situation, and the longer they stood there, the more uncertain he seemed. The man could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It wasn't anger or aggression, just confusion and hesitation. He was still processing everything that had happened so quickly. The man exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening for a moment around the leash as he looked down at his dog. It was difficult not to feel the loss. His pet had been more than just an animal to him. It had been his companion, his constant source of comfort after the years of turmoil he had endured. He had been through so much. The dog had been there through it all, the only one who truly understood the kind of life he had led. As he stood there trying to keep himself composed, he remembered the first day he had met his dog. He had been out of the army for a few months, unsure of what his future held, when he had walked into an animal shelter on a whim. There had been a lot of dogs there, all needing a home, but this one stood out, the way it looked at him, the quiet intelligence in its eyes. He knew right away it was the one. They had formed an immediate bond. The dog had a calmness to it that mirrored his own. It wasn't the loud, hyperactive kind of dog that demanded attention. It was a companion, quiet and steady, just like him. And in a world that felt like it was constantly shifting beneath him, the dog had been a reminder of stability. But now, standing here with the officers, that sense of stability felt distant, slipping away like sand through his fingers. "I'm not here to cause any more trouble," the man said, his voice quieter now, as he continued to address the woman officer. "I just want to go home. I don't want to escalate anything further." The woman officer nodded, her eyes never leaving him. She understood that the situation had already gone too far. She could see the subtle signs in his posture, the way he carried himself, the way his eyes flickered with something deeper. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. But there was something about him, something unspoken, that made her wonder about his past. She glanced at her partner, who still seemed unsure of how to handle the situation. He hadn't spoken since the first exchange, and she could tell he was struggling with his own thoughts. She felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to make a split-second decision, to have to react in a moment of fear. But the man in front of them wasn't the enemy. He wasn't someone to fear. She knew that much. "We don't want any more trouble either," the woman officer said, her voice calm and steady. "But we need to make sure we understand everything that's going on here. We need to make sure there's no misunderstanding." The man nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. He knew she was just doing her job, but it felt like he was stuck in the middle of something that was spiraling out of control. His dog had been shot. It wasn't even the dog's fault. It had been frightened, and in the chaos of the moment, the officers had made the wrong call. And now, here he was, caught in a conversation he hadn't wanted to have, with his life suddenly under scrutiny once again. "I understand," the man said, though his voice betrayed a hint of frustration. "But if you're asking me to explain myself, I don't know what else to say. I'm not who you think I am." The woman officer tilted her head slightly, her gaze still steady. "And who do you think we think you are?" she asked, her tone even, as though she was trying to understand the deeper layers of the situation. The man sighed, feeling the weight of the question. He knew that revealing too much about his past would complicate things further, but something about the officer's approach made him want to speak the truth. She wasn't like the others who had looked at him with suspicion. She wasn't making assumptions. She was just trying to get to the heart of the matter. "I'm not a criminal," the man said slowly, his voice measured. "I've just been through a lot. My past. It's not something I like to talk about. But I've seen things, done things that I never wanted to, and that's the truth. I'm not some criminal trying to cause problems. I'm just a man who wants to live quietly now." "That's it." The woman officer didn't flinch. She simply nodded as if she understood. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said quietly. "I just need to know that we're not in danger, that you're not someone who's going to hurt anyone, The man felt a flicker of something in his chest, a recognition, maybe, of the officer's understanding. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She was trying to make sense of the situation, and for the first time since this whole thing had started, he realized she might not be so different from him. She too was just trying to do the right thing. "I'm not dangerous," the man said, his voice steady once again. "Not anymore. I just want to move on. I want to forget the past. I want to forget everything that happened before." The woman officer stood quietly for a moment, processing his words. She could see the pain in his eyes, the struggle in his voice. It was clear that he wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to cover up something darker. He wasn't looking to hurt anyone. "All right," she said finally, breaking the silence. "We're not here to make things worse. But we need to make sure we're clear. We'll make a report about what happened and we'll leave it at that. But I'm going to ask you to stay calm. That's all we need right now." The man nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He could tell the situation was winding down, but there was still that bitter edge to it. The loss of his dog, the tension with the officers, the nagging feeling that things could have been handled differently. He still wasn't sure how everything would resolve, but for now, he was ready to move forward. As the woman officer walked back to her patrol car, her partner finally spoke, his voice quieter now, the tension from before lifting slightly. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he said, his gaze lingering on the man and his dog. I didn't know what to expect." The man gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I understand. But next time, maybe think before you pull the trigger." The officer's face flushed with embarrassment. "You're right," he said, his voice low. "I shouldn't have acted so quickly." The man said nothing more, his mind still lingering on his dog, the empty space where it used to be by his side. As the officers returned to their vehicles, he bent down one last time, touching the collar where his dog's tags once hung. It wasn't the closure he had wanted, but it was a step forward. A small, quiet one. The days after the incident passed slowly, like the lingering ache of a wound that hadn't quite healed. The man went about his routine, though it no longer held the same peace it once had. The quiet walks, which had always been a source of solace, now felt empty. His dog's absence was a constant reminder of what had happened. He couldn't shake the image of that moment, the officer's hand on the gun, the sound of the shot, the confusion that had followed. It was like a scar on his mind, one that he couldn't easily ignore. He continued to walk every morning, just as he had before. But the path now seemed longer. The streets felt colder. The neighborhood, which had once felt like a quiet haven, now felt like a place where the past was always waiting to catch up with him. The officers had left, but the aftermath of the encounter lingered. Every so often he would see one of the officers again. He had noticed them in passing on more than one occasion, their patrol cars moving through the streets as they went about their duties. They seemed to avoid eye contact, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps because they simply didn't know how to approach him after what had happened. Whatever the reason, it wasn't something he held against them. The man understood how easy it was to make mistakes, how quickly things could spiral out of control in a tense situation. But that didn't change the fact that they had taken away something precious to him. His dog was gone, and nothing could bring it back. The loss cut deeper than he had anticipated. What hurt the most was the helplessness he felt, the feeling that, despite everything he had been through, this was a battle he couldn't fight. He couldn't bring his dog back. He couldn't undo the past. As he walked that morning, the weight of everything hung over him. He passed by the same houses, the same trees, the same familiar landmarks, but nothing seemed the same anymore. The silence that surrounded him was deafening, like a reminder that everything he had worked for, everything he had fought for, was slipping through his fingers. He had once been part of something bigger, part of a team that had operated in the shadows. Now he was just a man walking a lonely road. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way, this emptiness, this longing for something more. But it was the first time in a long while that he couldn't shake it. The mornings had always been his time for reflection, for clearing his mind, but today it felt different. Today his mind was clouded with memories that refused to fade. He had seen so much over the years, things that no one should have to see. He had been part of missions that had tested his limits, that had pushed him to places he never wanted to go. But through it all, there had been one constant: his dog. The dog had been there for the quiet moments, the moments when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. It had been there when he returned home after long deployments, when the nightmares from his past kept him awake at night. The dog had been his anchor, his reminder that there was still some good in the world, still something worth holding on to. Now without it, the man felt adrift, like a ship lost at sea. As he walked, he noticed a car pull up beside him. It was one of the officers, the woman who had spoken with him after the incident. She was alone this time. No partner to be seen. She slowed the car to a stop, rolling down her window as she called out to him. "Hey," she said, her voice softer than before. "Can I talk to you for a second?" The man stopped in his tracks, unsure of how to respond. He had expected to see the officers again, but he hadn't expected this. She hadn't come to question him again, not this time. Her approach felt different, more genuine. He had thought about her since the day of the incident, wondering what she had thought of everything, wondering if she regretted how it had all gone down. He nodded, walking over to the car, his hands shoved in his pockets. "What's up?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her words coming out more quickly than he expected, "for what happened with your dog. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I don't think it should have gone the way it did. I'm sorry." The man looked at her for a moment, taken aback by the sincerity in her voice. He had never expected an apology. He had expected an explanation, maybe an acknowledgement that things had gone wrong. But this was different. This was personal, and for some reason it hit him harder than he thought it would. "It wasn't your fault," he said, shaking his head. "You were just doing your job. It wasn't you. You didn't pull the trigger." The officer nodded slowly, her eyes downcast for a moment. "I know, but I was there, and I didn't stop it. I should have done more to calm the situation down before it escalated." He felt a lump form in his throat as he watched her struggle with her words. He hadn't expected this kind of conversation, hadn't expected the woman to be so open, so honest. It was strange in a way to have someone, anyone, show this level of understanding about something that had happened between them. "I'm just trying to make it right," she continued, her voice quieter now. "I know I can't bring your dog back, but I want to make sure you know that I'm sorry for what happened." The man looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. It wasn't just the words that affected him. It was the way she said them, the genuine remorse in her voice. He had been prepared to hold on to his anger, to let the pain of the situation fester, but here she was offering something he hadn't expected, understanding. It didn't change what had happened, but it gave him a little bit of peace. "You don't have to apologize," he said finally, his voice steady again. "It wasn't your fault. You weren't the one who, well, you know. I don't hold it against you." She smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about the impact it had on you. I don't take that lightly." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The car idled quietly beside him, the sounds of the neighborhood drifting by in the background. The man had expected anger, maybe frustration, but he hadn't expected to feel the small warmth of forgiveness rising up inside him. The officer's words, her sincerity, were starting to chip away at the hardened wall he had built around his emotions. "Maybe one day, we'll both forget this ever happened," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "But for now, I'm just trying to move forward." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I get that, but just know you're not alone in it. And if you ever need anything, just reach out." The man didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what he would say. He didn't want to appear weak, didn't want to feel like he needed help. But the officer's offer was something that lingered in his mind. It wasn't something he had expected. It wasn't something he had asked for, but in that moment, it felt like the first step toward healing. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move on. "I appreciate that," he said finally, his voice quiet. The officer gave him one last look, a small but genuine smile, before driving away. He watched the car disappear around the corner, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in. It wasn't a miracle, but it was something, and for the first time in days, the heaviness in his chest seemed a little lighter. As he turned to continue his walk, he realized that maybe this was how life worked sometimes. Things went wrong, but sometimes they could be made right. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it never happened. It was about understanding, about taking small steps toward forgiveness, toward letting go, and maybe that was the hardest part. Letting go. The weeks that followed felt like a strange mix of healing and lingering sorrow. The man returned to his routine, but it was different now. The walks he took through the neighborhood no longer felt like a peaceful escape, but more like a slow process of moving through a place where something important had been lost. His dog was gone, and the emptiness of it was a constant companion. But there was something else in the air now, something quieter, something more subtle. It was the beginning of change. Every morning he still walked the same route, his feet pressing into the pavement with the rhythm of habit. The houses looked the same, the trees swayed in the same gentle breeze, and the sun rose in the same way, but nothing felt quite the same. His steps were slower now, his head held a little lower. The weight of loss still hung on his shoulders, but with every passing day, it felt a little more manageable. Sometimes he thought about the officer, her apology, her understanding. It had surprised him how much it had affected him. He hadn't expected it, but it had given him something to hold on to. A reminder that even in the darkest of moments there could be a spark of kindness, a glimmer of hope. And that was something he hadn't had in a long time. It had been a strange kind of forgiveness, not just of the officers, but of himself. He had spent so many years carrying the weight of his past, the missions, the dangers, the choices he had made. He had always tried to push it down, to bury it under the surface, but it was always there, lingering. And for the first time in years after that conversation with the officer, he felt like he could finally breathe. One morning, as he walked along the same path, he noticed something different. It wasn't the usual stillness of the neighborhood. There was a man walking his dog ahead of him. The dog wasn't anything special, just a small, scruffy thing wagging its tail as it walked beside its owner. But something about the sight of the man with his dog struck the man harder than he expected. It was a small, simple thing, but it stirred something deep within him, a longing for the companionship he had lost. He paused for a moment, watching the man and his dog as they walked ahead. The sight was a reminder of the bond he had shared with his pet. It was strange how something so ordinary could bring back so many memories, so much pain. But it also reminded him that life, despite its losses, continued to move forward. As he walked closer, the man with the dog turned and smiled at him. He wasn't sure why, but the smile felt genuine, like a shared understanding. The man slowed his pace and nodded in acknowledgement. "You all right?" the other man asked, his voice friendly but with a touch of concern. The man paused, considering the question. He didn't know why he felt like answering, but somehow, the words slipped out before he could stop them. "It's been a rough few weeks." The other man nodded knowingly, his dog tugging at the leash as it sniffed the ground. "Yeah, I get that. I lost my dog a while back, too. Took me a long time to get back to where I could walk again without feeling like something was missing." The man blinked, surprised at the stranger's words. It was the first time someone had said anything like that to him. He had expected sympathy, maybe even pity, but not this quiet, shared understanding. "It's hard," the man continued, looking down at his dog as it bounced around. "You don't realize just how much they're part of your life until they're gone." The man nodded again, a knot tightening in his chest. "Yeah, it's like they're always there and then suddenly they're not." The stranger smiled, a small knowing smile. "I don't know if it ever really gets easier, but it does get better in time. You start to find new things to hold on to." The man stood there for a moment, considering the words. There was something comforting in them, something real. For the first time since the incident with the officers, he felt like he wasn't alone in his grief. He had never expected a random stranger, walking a dog just like he used to offer him a sense of peace. But there it was. "You've got a good dog there," the man said, looking at the scruffy animal that wagged its tail excitedly at him. The other man grinned. "Yeah, he's a handful, but he's mine, and he keeps me going." There was a brief silence as the two of them stood there, watching the dog and feeling the weight of their shared experience. The man realized that maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. People, even strangers, could understand. They could offer support, even if it was just through a few words and a quiet acknowledgement of pain. The conversation drifted to other things: the weather, the neighborhood, the simple, everyday things that made up life. But underneath it all there was an understanding, an unspoken bond between the two men, each carrying their own loss, their own quiet grief. As they spoke, the man began to feel something shift inside him. He had been carrying this weight for so long, thinking he had to bear it alone. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one who had lost something. Everyone carried their own burdens. Everyone had their own battles. It didn't make the pain go away, but it made it a little easier to bear. Eventually, they parted ways, the man with the dog continuing his walk, and the other man continuing his. But as the man continued on his route, he felt lighter. The conversation had been brief, but it had changed something inside him. It had reminded him that life went on, even after loss, even after tragedy. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't always make sense, but it moved forward. And as he walked, he found that the street didn't feel as long as it had before. The houses weren't as empty. The neighborhood wasn't as quiet. There were people out there living their own lives, carrying their own losses, just like him. And maybe that was enough for now. Maybe that was all he needed to know. In the days that followed, the man noticed more and more people in the neighborhood, people he hadn't really paid attention to before. He saw the way they interacted, the way they connected with each other, and he realized that life wasn't just about the big moments, the triumphs, or the tragedies. It was about the small moments, the conversations, the shared smiles, the understanding that even in the midst of pain, there could be connection. There could be healing, and so with each passing day, he began to heal. Slowly, quietly, and in ways he didn't expect. The memories of his dog never went away, and perhaps they never would. But they weren't as painful as they once were. They had become a part of him, a reminder of the bond they had shared. And with that, he could finally take another step forward. He continued to walk every morning, the routine comforting him. And as he walked, he began to feel something new, hope. Hope for the future, for the possibility of new beginnings, for the chance to move forward without forgetting the past. Because sometimes the past didn't need to be erased. Sometimes it just needed to be understood, accepted, and let go. The man walked with a little more purpose now, his steps a little lighter. The world hadn't changed overnight, but he had. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.